Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My name is Jake, and I'm 26 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 months ago in Olympic National Forest in Washington State. I've never told anyone the full story before, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. Sarah and I had been together for almost 2 years when she decided she needed space. You know how that goes. She moved out on a Tuesday, and by Friday I was driving my beat-up Honda toward the mountains with nothing but a backpack and my grandfather's old camping gear. I needed to get away from everything, from the apartment that still smelled like her perfume, from the coffee shop where we had our first date, from all the places in Seattle that reminded me of us. The Olympic National Forest seemed perfect, endless wilderness where I could disappear for a few days and figure out what came next. I drove for about 3 hours before I found the trailhead I was looking for. It wasn't one of the popular ones, no fancy visitor center or paved parking lot. Just a small wooden sign that said, Ho River Trail, 12 miles, and a dirt pullout barely big enough for 4 cars. Mine was the only one there. The hike-in was brutal. 3 miles of switchbacks through old-growth forest so thick that even at 2 in the afternoon, it felt like twilight. These weren't the neat, managed trees you see in city parks. These were ancient giants, Douglas firs and western hemlocks that had been growing since before my great-grandparents were born. Their trunks were so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't wrap around them. The air was different in there, heavy and damp, thick with the smell of moss and rotting logs. Every step I took seemed to echo, even though the forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles. The only sounds were the occasional crack of a branch somewhere high above and the distant murmur of the Ho River. When I finally found a good spot to make camp, I was exhausted. It was a small clearing maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by trees so tall I couldn't see their tops. There was a ring of stones someone had made for a fire pit, probably years ago, judging by the lichen growing on them. I set up my tent on the only flat patch of ground and spent the next hour gathering firewood. By the time I got the fire going, the sun was setting, though you could barely tell through the canopy. The temperature dropped fast once darkness hit. I mean really fast. I went from wearing just a t-shirt to needing my heavy jacket within an hour. I made some instant ramen on my camp stove and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. For the first time in weeks, I felt peaceful, I guess. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no phone buzzing with texts I didn't want to answer. Just me, the fire, and the quiet. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe a bear. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Crunch, crunch, crunch through the undergrowth, but then I realized something that made my stomach drop. The footsteps were circling my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees and shadows, and the pale gleam of my light reflecting off wet leaves. But the moment I turned the flashlight off, I heard them again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Closer this time. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice sounded small and pathetic in all that darkness. No answer. Just the footsteps, still circling, staying just outside the reach of my firelight. This went on for maybe 20 minutes. Every time I shined the light toward the sound, it would stop. The second the light went away, the footsteps resumed. It was like playing some twisted game of red light, green light with an invisible opponent. Eventually, the sounds faded away, moving deeper into the forest. I stayed up until almost 3 in the morning, feeding logs to the fire and jumping at every noise. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight in my hand and barely slept. Morning came gray and drizzly, the way mornings always are in western Washington. I unzipped my tent and immediately saw them, boot prints in the soft earth around my campsite. They formed a perfect circle about 10 feet from my fire pit, like someone had been walking in a loop around me all night. The prints were huge. I wear size 10 boots, and these had to be at least size 13, maybe 14. The tread pattern was deep and aggressive, like work boots or hiking boots, but here's what really got to me. They were filled with water from the morning drizzle, which meant they were fresh. From last night, I told myself it was just another hiker. Maybe someone who'd gotten lost in the dark and was too embarrassed to ask for help. People do weird things when they're scared or confused. But why circle my camp? Why not just call out? I spent the day hiking along the river, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The forest was beautiful during the day, shafts of sunlight filtering through the canopy, the river running clear and cold over smooth stones. I saw a family of elk drinking at the water's edge and felt like maybe I was overreacting to what happened. But when I got back to camp around 6 o'clock, my fire was burning. I know I put it out that morning. I always put out my fires completely. It's basic camping safety. I'd stirred the ashes, poured water on them, stirred them again. But there it was, a small but healthy fire crackling away in my pit. Worse, the stones around the fire pit had been rearranged. Instead of a rough circle, they were now in a perfect octagon. Each stone was exactly the same distance from the center, like someone had measured them with a ruler. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. I stood there staring at that fire for a long time, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe the coals had reignited somehow. Maybe another hiker had stopped by and decided to be helpful. But the rearranged stones, that was deliberate, that was intentional. I should have packed up and left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. But pride, I guess, or maybe stubbornness, kept me planted. I wasn't going to let some pranking hiker scare me away from my campsite. The second night was worse. The footsteps started earlier this time, right around sunset. Same pattern, circling the campsite, staying just beyond the firelight. But now, there was something else. Every few minutes I'd hear a soft click sound, like someone taking a picture or maybe flicking a lighter. Around midnight I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and marched toward where the sounds were coming from. "I know you're out there," I shouted. "What do you want?" That's when I saw it. About 30 feet away, right at the edge of the tree line, stood a figure. Tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't make out any features because my flashlight seemed to make everything around it even darker somehow, but I could see the silhouette clearly, and it wasn't moving. I kept my light trained on it, waiting for it to run away or call out or do something, anything that would prove it was human, but it just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue. Minutes passed. 5, then 10. My arm started to ache from holding the flashlight steady, but I didn't dare lower it. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even sway in the wind that was rustling all the branches around it. After what felt like an hour, but was probably about 20 minutes, I couldn't hold the light steady anymore. My hand was shaking, and the beam was wobbling all over the place. I blinked just for a second, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by my fire with my back against a tree, flashlight in one hand, my camping knife in the other, waiting for dawn. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound made me jump. When the first gray light started filtering through the trees around 5:30, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't even take down my tent properly, just stuffed everything into my backpack and started hiking toward the trailhead in the pre-dawn darkness. The hike out was a nightmare. My headlamp kept flickering, even though I'd put in fresh batteries the day before. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps behind me on the trail, but every time I stopped and listened, There was only silence. I made it to my car just as the sun was coming up. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight home and didn't talk to anyone about what happened for weeks, but it kept eating at me. So finally I did some research online. What I found still gives me chills. Olympic National Forest has one of the highest rates of missing persons cases in the country. Since 1890, over 200 people have disappeared in that area without a trace. No bodies found, no clues, nothing. The most recent was a solo hiker named David Chen, who vanished just 6 months before my trip. But here's the thing that really got to me. I found forum posts from other campers who'd had similar experiences. Always the same pattern: footsteps at night, fires that relight themselves, and that tall, still figure watching from the trees. One post was from a woman who'd camped in the exact same clearing I'd used. She described the circle of boot prints, the rearranged fire pit, everything. Her post was dated 3 years ago. I've never been camping alone since then. Hell, I barely go into the woods at all anymore. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I still hear them. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Circling. Waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was watching me in those trees isn't done with me yet. My name is Sarah, and I work as a seasonal forest ranger for the U.S. Forest Service. What happened to me last summer in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina is the reason I'm thinking about finding a different job. I'd been working the night shift for about 2 months when this incident occurred. Night patrol isn't glamorous work. Mostly driving the back roads, checking on campsites, making sure no one's starting illegal fires or dumping trash. The pay isn't great, but I love being outdoors, and there's something peaceful about having the entire forest to yourself. Pisgah is beautiful country, especially at night. Rolling mountains covered in dense hardwood forest, old logging roads that wind through valleys where you might not see another human being for days. On clear nights, you can see more stars than you knew existed. Most of the time, the only sounds are owls, crickets, and the occasional coyote howling in the distance. But that night, July 23rd, I'll never forget the date. Everything felt different from the moment I started my shift. I was driving Forest Road 186, which runs along Bent Creek, when my radio started acting up. Instead of the usual chatter from dispatch, I was picking up fragments of conversations that didn't make sense. Static, then a few words, then more static. Around midnight, I heard something that made me pull over. Through all the white noise and interference, I heard a child's voice. Clear as day, this little kid saying, "Can someone help me? I'm lost and it's dark." I grabbed the radio mic immediately. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Thompson. I'm picking up what sounds like a distress call from a juvenile. Can you confirm any missing person reports in the area?" Nothing but static. I tried again. "Dispatch, do you copy? I need assistance with a possible missing child situation." Still nothing. My radio was completely dead except for that child's voice, which kept repeating the same thing every few minutes. "Can someone help me? I'm lost and it's dark." I'd been trained for this kind of situation. Lost children in the forest are a nightmare scenario. They can wander for miles, fall into ravines, die from exposure. Every minute counts. I started driving toward where the signal seemed strongest, deeper into a section of forest that's usually restricted to authorized personnel only. The road got rougher as I went, just 2 muddy tire tracks through increasingly thick woods. My truck's headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, and on both sides, the trees seemed to press in closer and closer. After about 20 minutes of driving, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a campsite in a small clearing just off the road. An old canvas tent, a smoldering fire, and a clothesline strung between 2 trees with children's clothes hanging on it. A little blue dress, tiny sneakers, a yellow raincoat. But here's the thing. This area has been closed to camping for 15 years due to unstable soil conditions. No one should have been out here. I parked and grabbed my flashlight, calling out as I approached. "Hello? Forest Service, is anyone here?" No answer, but the child's voice on my radio was getting clearer. "Can someone help me? I'm lost and it's dark." The campsite looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. The fire was still warm, just coals glowing in a ring of stones. There was a plate of half-eaten beans on a log next to the fire. The tent flap was open, moving slightly in the breeze. I shined my flashlight inside the tent. Sleeping bags, backpacks, the usual camping gear. But everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, like it had been sitting there for months, not hours. That's when I noticed the newspaper. It was folded next to one of the sleeping bags, and when I picked it up to check the date, my hands started shaking. Charlotte Observer, August 15th, 1987. The headline read, "Search continues for missing girl in Pisgah Forest, 36 years ago." I read the article with growing horror. A 7-year-old named Emma Hartley had disappeared while camping with her family in this exact area. She'd wandered away from their campsite during the night and was never found despite a massive search effort involving hundreds of volunteers and tracking dogs. The article described what she was wearing when she disappeared: a blue dress, yellow raincoat, and white sneakers, the same clothes that were hanging on the line right in front of me. I tried my radio again. "Dispatch, this is Thompson. I have a situation at—" Dead silence. Not even static anymore. I pulled out my cell phone, but I had no signal this deep in the forest. I was completely cut off. That's when I heard the laughter. It was coming from somewhere in the woods around me, high and musical, the way children laugh when they're playing hide and seek. But there was something wrong with it. Something that made my skin crawl. It was too loud, too clear, and it seemed to be moving. The laughter would come from my left, then from behind me, then from somewhere up ahead. Like whatever was making it was running circles around the campsite, staying just outside the reach of my flashlight. "Emma!" I called out, feeling ridiculous but not knowing what else to do. "Emma, is that you? I'm here to help." The laughter stopped. In the sudden silence, I became aware of how isolated I was. Miles from the nearest road. No radio contact, no cell service. Just me and whatever was playing games in the darkness. Then I heard footsteps. Small ones, like a child running through the undergrowth. They seemed to circle the campsite, getting closer with each pass. I spun around, trying to track the sound with my flashlight, but I never saw anything except trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped right behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. There was nothing there. But I could feel something watching me, something small and patient and very, very angry. That's when my radio crackled to life. Not the child's voice this time, but something else. Static and interference, but underneath it all I could hear what sounded like dozens of voices whispering together. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. They weren't friendly. I ran. I don't care how that sounds or what it says about my professionalism. I dropped my flashlight and ran through the woods toward where I'd parked my truck, branches whipping at my face and roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me, the laughter started again. Louder now, and there wasn't just one voice anymore. It sounded like a whole group of children playing some kind of game where I was the entertainment. I made it to my truck and threw myself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely grip the keys. As I reversed out of there as fast as I dared on that narrow road, my headlights swept across the campsite one last time. The clothes were gone from the line. The tent had collapsed, and standing right where the fire pit had been was a small figure in a blue dress. I floored it. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main ranger station, where I found my supervisor waiting with a worried expression and 2 other rangers. "Thompson, where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "We've been trying to reach you for hours. You missed 3 radio checks." I tried to explain what happened, but even as I was telling the story, it sounded insane. A campsite that shouldn't exist. Clothes from 1987. A missing child's voice on the radio. They listened politely, but I could see the looks they were giving each other. The next day, my supervisor and I drove back out to Forest Road, 186. We found the spot where I'd turned off toward the campsite, but there was nothing there. No campsite, no fire pit, no clothesline. Just unbroken forest stretching away into the mountains. But when I got back to the station and started going through old files, I found reports from other rangers, incidents dating back decades, all describing similar experiences in that same area. Radio interference, children's voices, mysterious campsites that disappeared by daylight, and every single report mentioned hearing the laughter of children playing in the darkness. I still work for the Forest Service, but I don't take night shifts anymore. And I've made it clear that I'm not comfortable patrolling the Bent Creek area under any circumstances. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I still hear that child's voice echoing in my memory. Can someone help me? I'm lost and it's dark. And I can't shake the feeling that Emma Hartley is still out there, still lost, still looking for someone to help her find her way home, even if home doesn't exist anymore. My name is Mike, and I'm a freelance writer from Boston. Last October, I rented a hunting cabin in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York for what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend writing retreat. Instead, I got 3 days that still wake me up screaming. I'd been working on a novel for 2 years, and my editor was breathing down my neck about the deadline. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere without distractions, where I could finally finish the damn thing. The cabin looked perfect in the Airbnb photos. Rustic but comfortable, completely isolated, no Wi-Fi or cell service to tempt me away from my laptop. The host, a guy named Frank, had been apologetic about the lack of modern amenities. "It's really off the grid," he'd warned me during our phone conversation. "No internet, spotty cell coverage, and you'll be about 8 miles from your nearest neighbor. You sure that's what you want?" It was exactly what I wanted. The drive up from Albany took about 3 hours, the last 45 minutes on increasingly rough dirt roads that wound through dense forest. Logging roads, Frank had called them, left over from when the area was heavily timbered in the early 1900s. Now they were mostly used by hunters during deer season and the occasional adventurous hiker. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and maples. It was bigger than I'd expected from the photos. 2 stories with a wide front porch and genuine log construction that looked like it had been there for decades. Smoke was rising from the chimney, which was a nice touch. Frank had mentioned he'd have a fire going for my arrival. I parked my rental car and grabbed my bags from the trunk. The silence was immediate and profound. No traffic noise, no airplanes overhead, no distant hum of civilization. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional crack of a branch settling somewhere in the forest. The front door was unlocked, as Frank had promised. I stepped inside and immediately felt like I'd traveled back in time 50 years. The walls were covered with vintage hunting photos and mounted deer heads. There was an old stone fireplace with a fire crackling away, and the furniture looked like it came from a 1970s hunting lodge catalog. But it was clean and comfortable, and more importantly, it was quiet. I set up my laptop on the kitchen table, unpacked my clothes, and spent the rest of the afternoon getting settled in. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I'd forgotten how cold October nights could be in the mountains. I added more logs to the fire and made myself some dinner from the supplies I'd brought. By 9 o'clock, I was feeling relaxed for the first time in months. That's when I heard the knocking. It started as a rhythmic tapping on the cabin walls, like someone rapping their knuckles against the logs. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more knocks from a different location. I figured it was just the old wood settling as the temperature changed, or maybe a woodpecker that hadn't gotten the memo about nighttime being for sleeping. I ignored it and kept working on my novel. But the knocking continued, and it was moving. Tap, tap, tap from the front wall, then tap, tap, tap from the side wall. Then from the back wall, like someone was walking around the outside of the cabin, knocking on the walls as they went. I saved my work and walked to the front window. The porch light was on, and I could see maybe 20 feet into the forest before the darkness swallowed everything. Nothing was moving out there that I could see. The knocking stopped. I went back to my laptop, but I couldn't concentrate anymore. Every few minutes I'd look up, expecting to hear those 3 knocks again. But the cabin stayed quiet for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the outside of the building just to see if I could figure out what had been making the noise. What I found made my stomach turn. There were muddy handprints on several of the windows. Not from the inside. These were on the outside glass, like someone had been pressing their palms against the windows and trying to look in. But here's what really bothered me. The windows were about 8 feet off the ground. I'm 6 feet tall, and I had to jump to reach them. Whoever left those prints would have had to be incredibly tall, or... I didn't want to think about the or. I spent the day trying to focus on my writing, but I kept getting distracted by every little sound. The cabin was old, and old buildings make noise. Creaking floorboards, settling timbers, the occasional groan of the wind moving through the structure. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but after the previous night, every sound seemed loaded with threat. Around noon, I took a break to make lunch and noticed something that stopped me cold. The coffee pot, which I'd left on the counter near the stove, was now sitting on the kitchen table, right next to my laptop. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if I'd moved it myself and just forgotten. But I'm obsessive about my workspace when I'm writing. I would never put a dirty coffee pot next to my computer. I searched the cabin thoroughly, checking every closet, every room, even looking under the beds. Nothing. No sign that anyone else had been inside. The front door was still locked, and it was the only way in or out unless someone wanted to break a window, but the coffee pot had definitely moved. I found the guest logbook that afternoon while I was looking for something to read. It was tucked away on a shelf next to the fireplace, a leather-bound book where previous renters had left comments about their stay. Most of the entries were normal. Comments about the beautiful scenery, the peaceful atmosphere, recommendations for hiking trails. But scattered throughout were entries that made my blood run cold. Loved the cabin, but something was knocking on the walls all night, probably just settling wood, but it kept us awake. Jennifer and Paul, September 2022. Great place to disconnect, but felt like we were being watched the whole time. Found handprints on the windows that weren't there when we arrived. Mark T., July 2022. Beautiful location, but we left a day early. Too many strange noises at night and things kept moving around inside the cabin. Would not recommend for solo travelers. Lisa Chen, October 2021. There were more entries like that, going back years, all describing the same things I was experiencing. The knocking, the feeling of being watched, objects moving on their own. I almost packed up and left right then. But I only had 1 day left, and I was so close to finishing my novel. I decided to stick it out. That was a mistake. The second night was worse. The knocking started earlier, around sunset. But this time, it wasn't just knocking. Something was scratching at the walls, like fingernails dragging across the wood. Long, slow scrapes that seemed to go on forever. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to confront whatever was making the noise. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The scratching stopped immediately. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, shining my light into the forest. Nothing, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. When I got back inside, every single cabinet door in the kitchen was standing open. I know they'd been closed when I went outside. I'm certain of it. But now they were all hanging open like mouths, revealing their empty contents. I closed them all and went back to my laptop, but I couldn't focus on writing. I kept getting up to check the windows, to make sure the doors were locked, to convince myself that I was alone in the cabin. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the front porch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone wearing work boots. They paced back and forth across the wooden boards, stopping occasionally right in front of the door. I crept to the front window and peered through the gap in the curtains. The porch was empty, but I could still hear the footsteps, clear as day, walking back and forth just a few feet away from where I was standing. Then they stopped, right in front of the door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock that never came. Instead, I heard the soft sound of the doorknob turning. I'd locked that door. I was absolutely certain I'd locked it, but I watched in horror as the knob rotated slowly, silently, until the latch clicked. The door swung open. There was nothing there, just the empty porch and the dark forest beyond. But cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the smell of pine needles and something else. Something rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. I slammed the door shut and twisted the deadbolt so hard I thought I might break it. Then I grabbed my laptop and my clothes and threw everything into my suitcase. I was leaving. Right now. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night or that the mountain roads were dangerous in the dark. Whatever was playing games with me in that cabin, I didn't want to meet it face to face. As I was carrying my bags to the car, I made the mistake of looking back at the cabin one last time. There, in the window of the upstairs bedroom, a room I'd never even been in, I saw a pale face looking down at me. It was there for just a second, just long enough for me to register the hollow eyes and the too wide smile. Then it was gone. I drove back to Boston without stopping, not even for gas. I called Frank the next morning to explain why I'd left early, but his phone went straight to voicemail. When I finally reached him 3 days later, he was apologetic, but not surprised. "Yeah, we've had some complaints about that place," he admitted. "Strange noises, things moving around. Some people say it's just the old building settling, but, well, you're not the first person to leave in the middle of the night." I asked him about the history of the cabin, and what he told me explained everything. The cabin had been built in 1962 by a man named Robert Hayes, who used it as a hunting retreat. In 1978, Hayes killed his wife and 2 children in that cabin before taking his own life. The murders had been particularly brutal, and the case made headlines throughout New York State. The property had changed hands several times since then, but no one ever stayed there long. Strange incidents, unexplained phenomena, the constant feeling of being watched. Eventually, it ended up being rented out to tourists who didn't know the history. "I probably should have mentioned it," Frank said, "but people don't usually ask about that kind of thing, and most folks don't have any problems." I finished my novel back in Boston, in my own apartment, with the deadbolt locked and the lights on. It came out last spring and did pretty well, considering. But I've never been able to forget that face in the upstairs window. Those hollow eyes, that terrible smile, and sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, I still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks, just like that night in the cabin. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that place followed me home. My name is Lisa, and I'm 24 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened 8 months ago in the Great Smoky Mountains, and I still can't explain it. I'm not sure I want to. My friend Jenna and I had planned this hiking trip for months. We're both from Atlanta, and we'd been wanting to do some serious mountain hiking before the weather got too cold. The Smokies seemed perfect. Challenging trails, beautiful scenery, and it was only about a 4-hour drive from home. We started early on a Saturday morning, planning to hike the Alum Cave Trail up to Mount LeConte. It's supposed to be one of the more challenging day hikes in the park, about 11 miles round trip with some serious elevation gain. We figured we were in good enough shape to handle it. The hike up was incredible. Clear skies, perfect temperature, and the fall colors were just starting to come in. We made good time and reached the summit around 2 in the afternoon, feeling pretty proud of ourselves. That's when everything started to go wrong. We were eating lunch on the summit when Jenna suddenly started wheezing. At first, I thought she was just winded from the climb, but it got worse fast. Her breathing became labored, and she was making this horrible rattling sound with each breath. "I can't breathe," she gasped, clutching at her throat. "Something's wrong." That's when I remembered. Jenna had severe allergies, bee stings, certain foods, even some types of pollen, and we'd been hiking through blooming wildflowers all morning. She was having an allergic reaction, and it was bad. "Where's your EpiPen?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Her face went white. "In the car. I forgot to put it in my day pack." I've never felt my heart sink so fast. We were on top of a mountain, miles from the nearest road, and Jenna was going into anaphylactic shock. Her lips were starting to turn blue, and her wheezing was getting worse by the minute. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. We were completely on our own. "Listen to me," I told her, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "I'm going to hike back down to the car and get your medicine. You need to stay here and try to stay calm. Keep your breathing as steady as you can." She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both knew that anaphylaxis could kill someone in less than an hour if it was severe enough. I left her with most of our water and started down the trail as fast as I could safely manage. The problem was, even moving quickly, the hike down was going to take me at least 2.5 hours. Then I'd have to hike back up, which would take even longer, but I didn't have a choice. For the first hour, I made good time. The trail was clearly marked, and I'd hiked it earlier that day, so I knew the route. But as the sun started to set, everything became more difficult. Mountain trails look completely different in the dark. Landmarks you notice during the day disappear into shadows. Rocks and roots that were easy to step around become ankle-breaking hazards. And the beam of a headlamp, no matter how bright, only shows you a few feet in any direction. I was about halfway down when I realized I wasn't alone on the trail. At first, I thought it might be other hikers. The Smokies are popular, and it's not unusual to encounter other people even late in the day. But when I stopped to listen, I could hear footsteps that seemed to match my pace exactly. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down, but I never saw anyone. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" No answer. Just my voice echoing off the mountain slopes and fading into silence. I kept hiking, but the footsteps continued. They stayed just outside the reach of my headlamp, always about 10 or 15 feet behind me. Every time I turned around to look, there was nothing there but empty trail and darkness. After another hour of this, I started to realize something was seriously wrong. According to my GPS, I should have been getting close to the parking area, but the trail markers I was seeing didn't match what I remembered from the hike up. I stopped at what should have been a familiar junction and pulled out my phone to check my location. The GPS showed that I was moving in a wide circle, like I'd been walking in loops for the past hour instead of heading downhill toward the trailhead. That was impossible. I'd been following the same trail the whole time, always heading downhill, always taking the most obvious path. But according to my phone, I was now further from the parking area than when I'd started. I tried to retrace my steps, but in the dark, everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, narrow dirt paths that could lead anywhere. My headlamp beam seemed weaker than it had been, even though I'd put in fresh batteries before we started the hike. That's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, like people having a conversation somewhere off in the woods. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was casual, friendly even. Like hikers taking a break and chatting about their day. "Hello," I called out, hoping desperately that I'd found other people who could help me get back on track. "Can you help me? I'm lost." The voices stopped immediately. I stood there in the darkness, listening to the sudden silence, and felt my stomach drop. Because in that moment of quiet, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The voices had been coming from multiple directions, not from one group of people having a conversation, but from different locations all around me. Like multiple conversations happening simultaneously in the forest. And now they were all silent, like they were listening for me. I started moving again, faster this time, not caring about following any particular trail. I just needed to get downhill, to get to the car, to get help for Jenna. But every direction I tried seemed to lead me deeper into the woods. My headlamp was definitely getting dimmer now, the beam growing yellow and weak despite the fresh batteries, and my GPS was showing increasingly impossible things. At one point, it claimed I was moving at 40 miles per hour, while I was clearly walking at normal speed. The voices started again, closer this time, whispered conversations that seemed to drift between the trees like smoke. I still couldn't understand the words, but there was something wrong with the rhythm of them. They were too fast or too slow, or the pauses between words were in the wrong places. "Who's there?" I shouted, spinning around with my failing headlamp. "What do you want?" The whispers stopped, and in the sudden silence, I heard something that nearly made me scream. Laughter. Soft, musical laughter, like children playing a game, but it was coming from above me, from up in the trees. I looked up and saw lights. Dozens of small lights moving through the canopy like fireflies, but brighter and more organized. They were arranged in patterns, forming shapes that almost looked like symbols or letters before dissolving and reforming into something else. And underneath each light I could swear I saw the outline of a human figure. They were in the trees. All of them, looking down at me. I ran. I don't know which direction I went or how long I ran through the darkness. Branches whipped at my face, roots caught my feet, and my headlamp finally died completely, leaving me stumbling blind through the forest. Behind me, I could hear them following, not just footsteps now, but voices calling to each other through the trees. Coordinating. Hunting. I don't usually ask, but if this story is getting under your skin, show it some love. It really helps. I crashed through undergrowth for what felt like hours, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with exhaustion. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw something that nearly made me cry with relief. Trail markers. Real ones, with official National Park Service. Blazes. I'd found the actual trail. I followed the markers as fast as I could manage, and within 20 minutes I could see the glow of the parking area through the trees. My car was sitting exactly where I'd left it, and I'd never been so happy to see anything in my life. I grabbed Jenna's EpiPen from her purse and started the brutal hike back up to the summit. By the time I reached her, it was nearly dawn and she was in bad shape. Her breathing was shallow and labored, and she was barely conscious. I administered the injection and called 911 on my phone, which suddenly had full signal again. The park rangers arrived within an hour and helped us get Jenna down to a waiting ambulance. She spent 2 days in the hospital but made a full recovery. When she asked me why it had taken so long to get back with the medicine, I told her I'd gotten lost in the dark, which was true as far as it went. But I didn't tell her about the voices or the lights in the trees or the way my GPS had shown me moving in impossible directions. I didn't tell her about the feeling that I'd been herded through the forest like prey, or the way the trail markers had seemed to rearrange themselves while I wasn't looking. A few weeks later, I did some research about the area where we'd been hiking. What I found didn't surprise me, but it didn't make me feel any better either. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park has the highest number of unexplained disappearances of any national park in the United States. Since the park was established in 1934, Over 1,600 people have vanished without a trace. Most are experienced hikers who knew the trails well. The area around Mount LeConte is particularly notorious. Local Cherokee legends speak of the Night Walkers, spirits that lead travelers astray in the mountains, causing them to become lost even on familiar trails. According to the stories, these spirits appear as lights in the trees and voices in the darkness, mimicking human sounds to lure people deeper into the wilderness. Most people who encounter them are never seen again. I found forum posts from other hikers who'd had similar experiences in the Smokies. GPS devices malfunctioning, trail markers that seemed to move, voices and lights in the forest that couldn't be explained. Most of them had managed to find their way out, but all of them described the same thing I'd experienced, the feeling of being hunted by something that understood the mountains better than any human ever could. One post particularly stuck with me. It was from a park ranger who'd worked in the Smokies for over 20 years. "The mountains are old," he'd written. "Older than our maps, older than our trails, older than our understanding. Sometimes they let us pass through safely, and sometimes they don't. If you ever find yourself lost in the Smokies at night, don't trust anything you see or hear. The only thing that matters is finding your way back to man-made light as quickly as possible. Because once you're truly lost in there, you might not be the one who decides whether you ever come out." I still hike, but never alone, and never at night. And I've never been back to the Smokies. Because sometimes, when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I still hear them, whispered voices drifting through my apartment just at the edge of hearing. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was playing games with me in those mountains knows where I live now. The Night Walkers are patient. They have all the time in the world, and they never forget a face. Those 4 encounters happened to real people in America's most remote forests. Each person lived to tell their story, but thousands of others aren't so lucky. Every year, hundreds of hikers, campers, and outdoor enthusiasts disappear in our national forests without a trace. The woods are beautiful during the day, but when darkness falls and you're miles from civilization, remember that you're entering something ancient, something that doesn't follow our rules, something that's been watching from the shadows long before we ever set foot on the trails. Thanks for listening. If you made it through all 4 stories, you're braver than most. And if you're planning your own trip into the deep woods, well, just remember what you heard here tonight. Sleep well.